Postdoctoral Fellow Kelsey Champagne for a virtual introduction to the exhibition Women of the Book, on view in the George Peabody Library Exhibit Gallery through January 31st. I'm Erin Jakowski, Senior Associate Director with the Office of Alumni Relations at Johns Hopkins University. This ongoing series is made possible through partnerships with the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Office of Alumni Relations Lifelong Learning. Thank you for joining us. Following the presentation, I encourage you to ask questions of our guest speaker in the Zoom Q&A located at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Claire Miller, President of Friends of the Libraries. Claire?
On behalf of the Friends of the Sheridan Libraries and Johns Hopkins University Libraries, I am delighted to welcome you to this month's Lunch with the Libraries, the December version of the Libraries. It is our ongoing speaker series that spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries. We are grateful to the partnership of the Johns Hopkins Office of Alumni Relations Lifelong Learning for their support in making the Lunch with the Libraries possible. We were formed in 1941. The Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries is one of the oldest university support groups in the United States, university library support groups. We provide financial support and advocacy for the Sheridan Libraries and organize events like this one to bring members of the campus and the wider communities to the libraries. The Friends includes people like you, alum, faculty, staff, students, parents, and community members. I encourage you very much to join us if you're not already a friend, to help ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the intellectual center of the university. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kelsey Champagne. Kelsey earned a PhD in History and Renaissance Studies from Yale University in 2021, where she wrote a dissertation on the resilience of Catholic communities in Scotland, Maryland, and the West Indies in the face of severe persecution at the hands of British imperial power. She is now the Stern Center's inaugural Curatorial Postdoctoral Fellow, where she has been involved in all academic and public programming for the center, including organizing lectures, conferences, and international master classes, teaching undergraduates, and mentoring PhD candidates interested in the field of curatorship. Dr. Champagne also worked as the co-curator of the Women of the Book exhibition, highlighting the intersection of spirituality and the written word across media in the lives of early Catholic women. She is currently studying the material culture, ritual practices, and economic history of a Florentine convent in the mid-18th century, from a diary and inventory meticulously recorded by the convent's keeper of the Christmas Principio in the Women of the Book collection. Kelsey, thank you very much for being with us today and for all that you do. With that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to everyone who's joining today as I take you through a tour de force of this incredible collection, and I'm going to visually overwhelm you with some of my favorite objects from the collection and exhibition. So I'm just going to share my screen. So the Women of the Book collection, as Claire has just mentioned, is a way to uncover voices of a particular subset of women from the early modern period, roughly 1450 to 1800, in Catholic Europe and Latin America. And we have done this through the lens of looking at nuns and other women who are involved with various institutions of the Catholic Church. And what this exhibition and collection does is place side by side printed books, manuscript books, objects of ephemera, art culture, material objects, and place them in one space so that scholars and researchers can begin to understand much more what women were producing, engaging with, and thinking in this period. So just a little bit about the background of this collection. It came to Hopkins about 6 years ago from a young bookseller who was traveling around Europe and trying to find basically some bang for his buck. He didn't have a ton of cash on hand, and he noticed that in so many bookstores, in the back, there would be cheaply printed, not very beautiful, frequently unbound, not illustrated, books about nuns who had died and were up for canonization. And these are basically tools in part of their campaign to become saints. And he approached Hopkins, and we were so excited to acquire this collection about women because this doesn't really exist in other institutions and other libraries. Of course, women are represented in other collections, but not as the primary and exclusive focus. And in the last 6 years, Earl Havens, the curator of rare books and manuscripts pre-1800 at Hopkins, has really worked to acquire much more material created within the space of the convent, not just about women, but for women and increasingly by women. And you can see here, just with this collage of some images, the real variety in genre, in media, the visual impact, the intellectual impact of this amazing collection. So I'm going to take you through some of the themes that are represented here, and buckle up because there's a lot coming at you, but it's going to be a wonderful tour to access all of these voices of women that we are so excited to share. So as I say, this is about women, spirituality, textual production. Many women who entered convents came from elite families and were educated and literate, or they received an education in the convent. And they had particular access to the print trade, whether through familial connections or through the connections of male authorities in the Catholic Church. So they were able to get many of their texts out into the world, but also to be creating texts and objects for their own use within the convent. This is over 750 objects, although increasingly that number keeps jumping up. It's close to 900 now. Surprisingly, majority are in the vernacular languages, so there's very little Latin in this collection, which really shocked me. When we do see Latin, it's usually in theological texts and liturgical texts, so music. And frequently, you'll see Latin side by side with other languages, which tells us that these women were much more focused on reading, communicating, and writing in their own native languages rather than in the ecclesiastical language of the church. And it's going global. So while most of the collection focuses on Catholic Europe, we have an increasingly growing corpus of materials from Latin America and even a couple of imprints from Manila in the Philippines, which I'll talk about later. This collection is rare defined. About a third of the objects are unrepresented in North American libraries. A quarter exist recorded in only a handful of copies. And about 20% are completely unrecorded by any private collections or institutions anywhere in the world. So they are unique survivals, which is incredible to bring together. And about a quarter contain unique manuscript annotations, which include notes on texts, but also original compositions in the margins of pages that are completely unstudied. So one of the greatest themes in this collection is music. We have printed music, manuscript music, some of which is entirely original and was potentially only sung in the convent from this text, maybe hasn't been heard in 350 years. Here you have an example of music being used as binding waste. So this is a ceremonial book in an Ursuline convent that has likely been bound in the convent, and they've used old manuscript music. Beautiful stencil work. We have two examples of these stenciled music books that were made by nuns for their own use and for the use of their sisters that are just absolutely gorgeous to look at. This one in particular is one of my favorites. And this charming manuscript is the oldest piece in our collection, dating from 1450. It's hard to tell here, but you can actually fit this in the palm of your hand. It is a little pocketbook. And it's a processional. So a nun would have had this open while she's moving through a processional, a ritual within the convent or within the church. And you can see that there's a 3-tonged bookmark of strips of leather, which is a completely rare survival because these are really fragile and obviously used very heavily. So that's wonderful. And it was made for a Cistercian nun and commissioned by her brother, who was a Cistercian monk about 10 miles down the road. So not only is this the most charming manuscript, but it also shows how relationships from outside the convent can be translated into the convent through the use of objects. We have examples of materials relating to reformed sex workers and abused women who were able to join convents and find refuge in these spaces that were created throughout Italy, called the convertite or the convertites, sometimes referred to as the Magdalenes, taking their inspiration from Mary Magdalene. And you can see on the right, there's a printer's device here, and it's Mary Magdalene with her flowing locks covering her naked body. And this was actually the printer's device of the convertites of a particular convent. So they had their own printing press where they were able to perform this labor, write these texts, print them, and sell them in order to generate revenue for the convent. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of controversy surrounding these women. Nuns were particularly respected in Catholic Europe for their virginal purity, for their holiness. They occupied a higher spiritual status that brought them closer to God. But because of the pasts of these women, they didn't always receive the same respect from their communities. So on the left, in this absolutely impossible to read manuscript, if you see this in the exhibition, I challenge you to try to read the page that it's open to. But it's a dramatized story of one of these women who joined the convent, tried to reform, but just couldn't. And so she escapes the convertite convent, has a rendezvous with a particularly powerful man in her city, and is actually strangled to death with a silk scarf, which just gives you a sense of not only the controversy, but also the aspersions of indulgence, of materiality, of vanity that were cast against these women really frequently in Italian society. And on the right, a different side of this controversy, you have a notification from authorities in the city of Bologna who are basically saying, stop undermining these women who are selling books. Some of them are also producing medicinal cures and selling those from convent pharmacies, but they're consistently being underpaid. And so this document is attempting to establish a financial equality for these women. So although they found refuge in these institutions, that by no means means that they weren't still facing particular struggles and prejudices from their surrounding communities. We have a whole cache of objects that we've called investiture ephemera. So these are all entirely unique, frequently single-page documents and works of art that are created for a nun when she joins the convent. So sometimes they're created by her friends or families, sometimes they're created by nuns in the convent and for the use of the convent, and sometimes they actually hire professional artists to come and create these. And they're completely unique, beautiful examples of art and of poetry that celebrate the moment when a woman or a girl steps across the threshold from the secular world into the religious community. So we have many examples. This one is beautiful and printed on yellow silk, but it's not really about the girls. So it celebrates 4 women who are joining an Augustinian convent, but the only person who's named is the archbishop. So here you can also see how these moments were opportunities for people to gain patronage from particular political players in their cities. But the rest are much more about the women. And all the images that you'll see here are from the same convent in Spain, collected over the course of about 40 years. We have 3 of these types of books in our collection that we call Libro de Profesiones. They are all from Spain, so we're starting to build an understanding as we collect that there might be a particular artistic phenomenon in Spain. In other places, we've seen chronicles where their convent will have a book where they list the names of every girl who joins and every girl who has passed away. But to have this collection of really diverse, beautifully intricate pieces of art is something that so far we are only seeing in Spain. And because of that, this is another avenue for scholarship that is only possible when you start to put all of these kinds of objects together. The one on the left is made with lacquer, so it's incredibly thick, whereas the others are made with all kinds of different pigments and paints, and they all list the girls who are coming. So by putting these together, you really can build the history of one institution. Where are their families? What kinds of families are sending their daughters and their sisters into convents? What is the relationship between this convent and the broader society? So an absolutely untapped area for research. We have Rockstars and Superheroes in our collection. So on the left and right are both different images of Teresa of Avila, who was an absolute celebrity in her time. She wasn't just an inspiration for nuns or for women, but everyone around Catholic Europe knew who Teresa of Avila was. She was canonized very shortly after her death. And she reformed the Carmelite order and actually founded 17 convents during her lifetime. So on the left, you can see her playing her 12-string mystical guitar of obedience and humility. On the right, this is a proto-comic book. So it's actually 3 volumes, and she meets all kinds of characters on her journeys throughout Europe. They're holding speech bubbles. We haven't seen anything like this. And with Teresa in particular, you get every kind of iconography, from deeply theological, really emotive imagery, texts on prayer, beautiful plate books where you don't have to be literate to engage with them, and these elements of pop culture. So she really becomes the people's woman and a real inspiration for everyone throughout Europe. And then in the middle, we have Maria de Agreda, who is a fascinating character. She was a bilocating nun. So this means that her physical body forever stayed in her convent in Spain, but her metaphysical essence left her body and traveled to the New World, and she converted to Christianity the Humano people of what is now Texas and New Mexico. And when Franciscan missionaries arrived a few years later, they found that all of these indigenous people that they had come to Christianize already knew the name of God and had crucifixes and already knew who Jesus Christ was. And they were so confused, so they asked, who came before us? And they said, oh, the blue nun already came to us and converted us. But Maria de Agreda is also famous for another reason. She had many mystical experiences, but her most famous vision was of the Virgin Mary, who dictated her own autobiography for Maria to transcribe and bring out into the world. And so here you have Maria de Agreda receiving the divine inspiration from the Virgin Mary and writing down this autobiography, which was incredibly controversial, which should come as no surprise. She was faced the Inquisition, and her book was on and off censorship lists for a long time. She never actually became a saint, but one of the most absolutely fascinating characters. We have this whole genre of materials that are made in the convent as pieces of art, but also objects of devotion and contemplation. We call these Klosterarbeit, art of the cloister. And these are materials that I have never heard of. No scholars work on this, completely unheard of. Sometimes some scholars may have seen one of these and thought, oh, okay, there's something interesting artistically going on in one of these convents. But when you start to place together 6 or 7 or 10 or 12 of these, we realize that actually there was a whole transnational style of art being produced within these convents. And you can see the influence of some female domestic embroidery patterns, but they're not using thread. They're using gold and silver and copper wires and creating all of these flowers, flourishes, different motifs that end up appearing in art that's coming from many different places. So you see 2 examples here, another here of a contact relic where this pillow is again designed in some of the same style. This is actually a holy water font, and it's made with little strips of wood that have been woven together. So the front was made separately from the back, then they're stuffed with straw and stitched around the edges to close it. And this belonged to the richest of the rich Visitantine nuns. That's their emblem in the middle. And this probably would have hung in a private cell. At the bottom, it's hard to see in this picture, but if you go to the exhibition, you can see the little dish for holy water. Just absolutely magnificent. And when nuns are creating these objects, they're praying with every stitch. And so these objects become filled with spiritual powers and at the same time inspire contemplation and devotion as the nuns are creating these. So even in the mode of artistic and creative production, there's still this element of spirituality completely present with all of this. My favorite of this genre are the book amulets. So these have healing powers. They only have healing powers when they're kept closed. As soon as you open it, the magic just goes poof and it's gone. So none of ours are magical anymore because we've opened every single one of them. But these seem to be unique to Bavaria in the 18th century. And I won't tell you what's in the middle yet. I won't give away the secret. But nuns would pray as they're creating these and then use all kinds of printed and manuscript text and images to fold these almost like Russian nesting dolls. And a pilgrim could buy this, generate money for the convent, and then wear it around their neck or at their waist and be protected from temporal things like thunderstorms and hurricanes, but also demonic temptations. So with this particular one, when you open it up, you see this series of engraved images of saints. And in the bottom middle, you can see that when you lift that up, there's another woodcut image underneath. And in the center is this printed text. And when you unfold it, it explains what this is protecting you from. Now, of course, again, it loses its power when it's open, so nobody was supposed to actually read this, but it is there. And in the center, you have even more manuscript text, and underneath that is the relic. And here we have a saint medal, holy grains, pieces of textile, little palm fronds that have all been glued and sewn and stitched to create this relic. And this is what contains all of the spiritual power imbued from the nuns. These are incredible. There are other kinds of, the fancy term for these is apotropaic prints, so prints that have these healing powers. On the top left is a copper plate. It's about the size of your hand, maybe a little bigger than an iPhone. And this belonged to the Capuchin nuns in Puebla, who used this very copper plate to print documents like the one on the right, which has been a digitally rendered version of the copper plate that our conservation team created. So again, people could wear these small prints, fold them up and wear them on their person to protect them from all kinds of evils and dangers. And then there's also this phenomenon of holy links. So things that are made to reflect particular dimensions of the body part of a holy person. So up on the right corner, that's supposed to be to the dimensions of the foot of the Virgin Mary, and having this would also protect you. And in the bottom, we have a birthing belt. So it's these printed German texts that are stitched together and meant to be worn to protect a pregnant person for her pregnancy and childbirth. And I imagine that she didn't wear this during childbirth because it's in absolutely pristine condition. We don't know, but my guess would be that there was some kind of ceremony or ritual where she would have worn this belt and received a blessing from a nun, and that would have given her particular protections, but we're not really sure. But this one's kind of complicated, so bear with me. There's a legend that the Virgin Mary's house from the Holy Land was flown by angels and deposited in Loreto in Italy. And there was a statue at the Holy House of Loreto of the Virgin Mary when she was pregnant with baby Jesus. And so someone measured the circumference of the pregnant stomach of this statue and created this holy length from those dimensions. It's just absolutely fabulous. If anyone reads German, this is a great place to start to get into this collection. This is the inventory that Claire mentioned I've been working on. So a nun, Sister Mathilde Benvenuti, kept this for over 30 years, and she was the keeper of her convent's presepio, the Christmas creche, which involved beautiful statues that were decked out in velvet and silk and corals and pearls and gemstones with wonderful wigs. And this details how they used all of the statues and how they dressed them. And it's wonderful because, of course, when a nun enters the convent, she gives up the opportunity to have children and to have her own family. And so here she is partaking in these rituals of the Holy Family. But it also gives an idea of the economic and social relationship between the convent and the surrounding communities, because of course she has to work with artisans in order to make all of the objects for the presepio. So it's not that convents were just completely isolated from their surrounding communities. They never would have survived. And here's the index, but she also has a very detailed inventory for every single year that she's in charge of the creche. And here's an altarpiece from that convent that survived. So you can see how luxurious and decadent their art was. Again, these are not spaces that are dark and musty and quiet, but really vibrant and colorful. And again, the production of art making and object making is spiritual. So it's not that there's vanity involved in this, but actually spiritual development. And they're just absolutely beautiful. My total favorite piece in the whole collection is this book of 2 printed books of hours that have been bound together. The first is from 1501, which is really early. We date the invention of the printing press by movable type, so as we know it, to about 1450. So 1501 is very early, and you don't often see many illustrations, but this one is very heavily illustrated. And you can see in the image on the right how much manuscript there is. So this book was used to death. It was hanging by literal threads when it arrived to us, and our conservation team has rebound it. And it was used by so many different people. There are different hands, different inks. Some are responding to the printed text and transcribing. Some are translating. One person has actually been so inspired by reading this text and contemplating that they've created their own original poetic and prayer compositions that don't exist anywhere else. You have other hands that are engaging with those written compositions. So many layers and generations of readers and users of this book, one of whom was Catherine Raoul, who was a Carmelite nun. And you can see on the left that her name has been stamped in gold, which is incredible because nuns are not supposed to have possessions. They take a vow of poverty. And so while they could have books, and the convent libraries absolutely did have books, to stamp your name on the cover is a real assertion of the personal value of this object. And even more so, she's also had her name engraved on the clasps. So Catherine on the top and Raoul on the bottom. And Earl and I have talked to every expert bookbinder and conservator and curator that we know, and no one has seen this. So it's quite unusual for clasps to survive because they're constantly being opened and closed. But to see one with someone's name engraved is so, so rare. And it just really speaks to the deluxe book that this is and how this was treasured, not only by Catherine, but by so many users. This is a Jubilee manuscript printed on parchment for a nun named Isabelle Dubois on the 25-year anniversary of her becoming a nun. And Isabelle was an Ursuline nun. They were famous for being educators. So they would bring girls from the surrounding community into the convent to board temporarily and receive a full humanities education. And when Isabelle became a nun, she changed her name to Rosalie in honor of Saint Rosalie. So you see all of these different artistic and creative elements here created by her students. So this top image of the 2 suns is accompanied by a poem that explains how just as the Son of God and the sun itself, the lights reflect off of each other in perfect beauty, so too do the lights of Isabelle and Rosalie. Here we have an image of a beehive, and the poem explains that bees are industrious and dutiful and obedient and hardworking, just like the perfect nun. And if anyone speaks French, you would know that the word for bees in French is abeille. And if you scramble around all of the letters in Isabelle's name and rearrange them, you get abeille. So we have not only emblematic images, not only poetry, but also an anagram. And at the bottom, a chronogram. So if you do the same scrambling with these Roman numerals, it will add up to the year that this was made, 1698, and the place is Lille. And all around the edges are nail holes. So you can see that this was clearly hung either in Isabelle's cell or around the convent, a very treasured possession and a real example of the sorority and community that some women created within the space of the convent. And it's beautiful. This, again, the convent is not a space of just quiet darkness, but also of community. And that's really clear here in this board game created for Ursuline nuns. And in the center here, it explains that you don't have to pray all day. You don't have to just be silent and contemplative, but you can also have a good time and use this board game as a way to teach novices about the history of their convent, their history of their order, which is again the Ursulines, and to have a little bit of fun. And so you move around the board just like we do today in so many games with little pieces and a dice, and you can get flown ahead by angels or pulled back by devils. and you win when you arrive at this final spot of Ursula with the 11,000 virgins under her cloak. This is Rose of Lima, and she really embodies our mission to take this collection and expand much more globally. So Rose of Lima was a Criolla who was born in Lima, Peru. That means that she was born to European parents. So she is white European. She has no indigenous blood. And she wanted to join a convent, and her parents said no. So she just created one in her own home. And on the left and right, you can see her engaging in acts of self-mortification, which was a way to imitate Christ's suffering in order to achieve greater union with him, and also to overcome the physical limitations of the body and liberate the soul in order to have a much deeper metaphysical and mystical experience. And in the middle, you can really see her imitating Christ as she performs the Stations of the Cross. And this book was printed in Antwerp, which was the height of printing of these beautiful plate books. So you have a saint from the New World being represented visually in Antwerp, and also in Manila, in the Philippines, where this Spanish edition was printed. So Rose of Lima's cult went all over the world and has really inspired, even continuing now, all kinds of art and text, a truly global saint. And I just want to finish by placing two objects side by side. This is more Investiture Ephemera. So again, those artistic pieces that are created when a nun joins a convent. These two are both done by professional artists. You can see when they're placed side by side that some of the decorative ornaments around the borders are very similar, although they're created in different places by different people. But this one is a marriage degree. So you see the marriage between the nun and Jesus. Of course, nuns become what's called brides of Christ when they join a convent. And around the text, you have again the crown of thorns, which is also serving as a marital ring, and her vow that she is taking and professing publicly and out loud. And at the bottom, she's written her own name and basically signed this contract. So I, Maria Cherubina, vow that I take this profession of sound mind and voluntarily. And with this example of Maria Casellati, who was not literate, she still has her vow here that she's also taken orally and professed publicly, but instead of writing her name, she has left her mark, which is that cross in the bottom right corner. And I like to place these two side by side because I am so proud of the work that this collection has done to uncover the voices and the production and the activities of women that scholars just really have only known in very small numbers. We've only touched the tip of the iceberg. And yet there's still so much more to be learned by the women who were not leaving written records behind, and whose voices and whose lives can be accessed through the material culture that they were engaged with. And I'm very excited moving forward to think more deeply about how we can access those lives and those voices that are not necessarily represented by the written record. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to see some of you at the exhibition. I'm always happy to give tours, and I welcome any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. I think I'm on screen now. Fantastic. What a beautiful presentation. And I love that you said you really are lifting up the voices, the production, and the activity of these women and their complex mystical lives, their spiritual lives, their personal lives. This cries out to be seen in person. So there is still space if anyone would like to join the tour on Wednesday, and I will leave some information for that in the chat. But now is the time for questions from the audience. So please jump in and use the Q&A feature to ask your questions of Kelsey. I'm sure you have many, but I'll kick it off with a question for you. Can you speak more about the process of building a rare books collection like Women of the Book?
Yeah, so with this particular collection, as I said, it started off as a distinct collection that was brought to Hopkins. So the bookseller had already amassed about 350 to 400 objects, which is one way that collections arrive. So sometimes you have a collector who does a lot of that legwork to create a thematic collection and then brings it to a university or a museum or a library. So that's the way it happened with Women of the Book. And when the bookseller approached Earl, he said, do you want this collection of nuns? And Earl said, not really, but I would love a collection about women. And so then he really ran with that. And as I said, focused so much, not on how women were represented, because the original collection is a lot of short books and longer books, but by men about women. And since then, we've really tried to focus on the women themselves and what they are writing, what they are producing, what they are saying. And of course, once word gets out, then you have all kinds of different booksellers and book collectors who realize that Hopkins is interested in this material. And when you have then about a dozen people who are actively searching, that's when you really start to develop a diverse collection of all of these different kinds of materials that are coming from all over Europe, but also other places in the world, different institutions, different private collections. So that's been really exciting. Of course, the other way to build a collection is to start with a theme and to start building that from the ground up and taking step one at the institution, which is another way that we've been collecting with some of our other collections as well. But that was the process for Women of the Book.
Wonderful. I was saying, I'm looking at this other question. I know you have shared with us already some of your favorites from the exhibition. And I can't quite believe this is your first exhibition that you've curated. Congratulations. It really is mind-blowing. But maybe you could share again some of your favorite parts, and did anything surprise you about this process?
Oh yeah, everything surprised me. Someone asked me when I was giving a tour yesterday, who is your favorite saint? And I said, I don't really have one. And they said, okay, so who's your favorite like woman in this collection? And I said, actually, the saints are not as exciting to me because they are saints because they're perceived as having followed all the rules and done everything within the confines of the Catholic Church. And how they're perceived has been approved. So there's one object that I didn't mention in this presentation, but that is in the exhibition. And it's a document by a new Archbishop of Cesena. And he basically comes in and he wants to put the hammer down, and he is going to streamline everything, and he's going to ensure that all of the monastic institutions under his purview are behaving well. And so he creates this broadside for a convent in Cesena. And he says the nuns cannot communicate in the parlor, which is this space where people from the surrounding community can come and speak to the nuns through a grate. So they can't see each other, but they can communicate. So he says you can't do that anymore unless you have express written permission ahead of time from the abbess. You're only allowed to talk about certain things in there. You can't gossip with each other during your downtime. You can't whisper in church. And of course, all that tells us is that this is exactly what the nuns were doing. So for me, my favorite parts are when you see examples of nuns completely misbehaving and flouting the rules and exerting their own authority and kind of creating their own experiences. And then in terms of surprises with curating, I started working on this when I was still in graduate school. I got a call from Earl, who I had known since I was an undergrad, and I had been working on Catholic women. And he said, I just got this collection. Do you want to curate the exhibit? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I'm a graduate student. Of course, that's what I want to do. So I spent a summer here in 2017. And at that time, it was probably 400 objects. So it was mostly the original collection and then maybe about 40 pieces that he had already acquired since then. In my mind, I designed the entire exhibition. The reality of the exhibition looks nothing like that. This was supposed to happen in 2020, so we've been delayed in 2020 and then again in 2021. But it benefited the show because so many of the most extraordinary pieces have come later. And in the process of curating, it was amazing to me how much collaboration goes into an exhibition, which I loved. So it's not just the two curators, but it's also the entire conservation team who is preparing all of the objects and making sure that they can handle being shown. We built a nun cell, so we also worked with construction workers, all kinds of people, librarians, materials managers, archivists, collectors, booksellers, donors. So it was really incredible to see so many people come together to make this the best show that it could be. It was so exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm reeling from what I didn't expect in your presentation and what I saw still of what I guess my own expectations of what these women's lives would have been. I wasn't expecting the murder intrigue. I wasn't expecting, the board games, and I love this one, the 12-string mystical guitar, that was there. That illustration was incredible. So again, I can't wait to see it in person. So, another question that we have here is, this collection, is about Catholic women, most of whom took holy vows. But what can you tell us about the lives of women more broadly in the period?
Yeah, so accessing women through what they were writing and creating is kind of the best way to understand what we think we know and what we're kind of wrong about. So we tend to have this perception of a really strict patriarchy in European society in the early modern period, which is absolutely accurate. But within that, there were spaces and modes for women to exert their own intellectual, spiritual, cultural, artistic authority. So we have lots of writings also by secular women. If you're particularly interested, there's a wonderful series called The Other Voice, which it must have 40 books right now. And they're all English translations of works written by women. So not just by women religious, but also secular women. What I've found by comparing some of the ways in which these different groups of women can treat materials is that when women in convents want to say something a little bit more controversial or maybe disagree with a theology or propose a new method of devotion, they have to be really creative with how they do that because they take a vow of obedience. They have to be obedient to what their superiors tell them. They have to adhere to the beliefs of the church and the institution that they live within and that they represent. So they do this in really creative ways. There's one example. An autobiography by mandate was a really popular thing. So basically a male priest confessor would say to one of the nuns that he worked with, you need to write an autobiography. And this was kind of a scary thing because that usually meant that they were having mystical experiences and the autobiography would be used to judge whether those were inspired by the divine or by the demonic. And so that's a very fine line between potentially becoming a saint after death or potentially being considered a heretic or getting in trouble for doing something slightly unorthodox. So there's this wonderful book of a woman who is asked to do this autobiography by mandate. And so she writes a fictional account of a woman who's asked by her priest to write an autobiography. And every day she and the fellow nuns talk about the best way to do this. And in those conversations, they joke about some of the things that they disagree with in their convent. They challenge elements of theology. And when they get just to the line of potentially saying something problematic, they say, oh, it's time for lunch. We have to leave. We'll get back to this conversation tomorrow. Whereas secular women have, when they're writing and when they're in a place of privilege. So it's frequently noble women, wives and daughters and sisters of kings and princes, but they tend to have a bit more flexibility with how far they can push their political and ecclesiastical critiques. And so for me, that's been one big difference. But one similarity is just women are absolutely thinking. They're not just being told what to think and what to believe, but they're forming their own ideas and they're circulating those, whether it's within their community, be that religious or secular, and without. And I think that it's been really helpful to place all of these materials side by side and to think about transforming our ideas of what not only women thought, but also the kinds of institutions and production materials that they had access to.
Yes, thank you. Let's see, we have another question here asking, what are some ways to access these voices that are silent and in the archives? And it reminds me a bit because early on you were talking about the music that is part, the sheet music that is part of this exhibition, and the idea that we haven't heard that music for hundreds of years. It's another way we're bringing that out of out of the silence. So, but the question is, what are some of those ways to access those voices that are still silent in the archives?
Yeah, music is a wonderful way because also music brings people together. So you don't just have one nun who's singing. And obviously thinking about the circulation of these materials within the convent. I mentioned really briefly that a lot of these books have manuscript annotations. That includes ownership inscription. So you can start to trace for some of these even from the 17th through the 20th century have ownership inscription. So you really can build an idea of the multi-generational use of these objects. Music is a great way. It is true that probably a lot of this has not been sung. Also, the musical notation is different. So that's kind of challenging because someone today who's a musicologist who doesn't particularly study this period might have difficulty playing those songs and singing the hymns. But another way is just looking at the objects. So every woman in a convent had to perform a labor. So the richest nuns were called choir nuns, and they came from elite families. So the choir nuns would sing, and that was their labor. So they're the ones who can sing at mass. Other nuns can sing in the convent at other times, but when they're at mass, it's only these elite women who are singing, but other nuns are performing other kinds of labor. So at the most extreme, you actually do have servants who can either serve the entire convent or serve one woman in particular. You have women who work in the kitchen, women who work in the infirmary. Those are people who are really difficult to access because they're often not writing, although sometimes they are, but we know that they exist. And so how do you access them? Well, you can think about the kinds of herbs that they're growing in their gardens. You can look at records and think about what they're selling from their pharmacy. So it's going to be lower status women who are probably producing those. But also all of this embroidery work and the artistic production, it's unclear who in the convent is actually making those. But I think the more that we build up the material culture and the objects, the more that we study things like Investiture Ephemera, where women are really named, the more that we can start to access a much larger and broader community of female representation.
Great, great. So as suspected, people are chomping at the bit trying to see this in person. Some can attend the 10 a.m. on Wednesday. Others were asking if there are plans for additional tours, perhaps on the weekends, to make things easier for folks who can't come during the week. And is it possible the collection would become a permanent exhibition?
I don't think so. I don't know that that's ever happened at Hopkins, that it would be a permanent exhibition, but it's certainly a permanent collection. And anyone can come and work with the collection at Homewood campus, which is the main campus at Hopkins, but you can also use materials at Evergreen, which is where the collection lives, or at the Peabody Library, which is the best place. But probably not a permanent exhibition. It also won't be a traveling exhibition. So this is the only place to see it. It's up until January 31st. I am always happy to give tours of this exhibition, and you can email me and we can set up a private tour, but I am only in town through December 16th. And then I head out for the holidays and actually have a fellowship in January. So you're welcome to see it anytime between now and January 31st on your own. But if you'd like a tour, I suggest that you email me pretty soon and get that on the books. But even after the objects are taken out of the show, they'll be back into the permanent collection, and anyone can register as a reader. A lot of this is digitized, about 60%. So if you Google Women of the Book JHU, it can bring you to archive.org, and you can see so much of this digitized already and access that online. There's also a downloadable catalog that you can keyword search. So if you are interested in working with materials in person, you can email me if you have a particular interest. But you can also take a look through that catalog, and that all has links to the Catalyst record, which is Johns Hopkins online catalog, and you can request materials through there. And I will say that it's an amazing experience to handle one of these books, and you just get immediately transported into the past, and to forge that tangible connection with someone from the past who has handled this, in many cases here, like who has created this, is so wonderful. And I really do encourage anyone who's interested to give yourself the opportunity to have that experience and work with some of these materials in person.
Wonderful. Thank you for all of those additional resources and ways to access the collection, whether in person or through the archives. Margaret has shared the collection has been digitized and is available on the Internet Archive. And there's a website here. I'll just put that in the chat as well. So I think with that, that might be our last question for you, Kelsey. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your time and your talent. We'd also like to thank Claire and our producer, Harry Heaps, today for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. As you've shared, this will be recorded, this particular webinar, and we can share that with everyone who is registered today with a link with a follow-up of those resources and our future event schedule. And as I said, please join the tour if you can on Wednesday. I'll put that information in the chat as well, led by Kelsey Champagne and Earl Havens on Wednesday, December the 7th at 10 a.m. at the Peabody Library. You just need to email libraryfriends@jhu.edu to reserve your spot for that in-person tour and include how many are in your party. So thank you again, and we hope you will join us for a future webinar. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you so much, everyone.